The rain had begun before sunset, a steady curtain of water that blurred the city skyline into smudges of neon and gray. From the 22nd floor, the streets looked like silver veins, slick with headlights that stretched and bent under the storm. Inside, the offices of Halcrow and Myers glowed with artificial light, each floor alive with murmurs, ringing phones, and hurried footsteps. But in one corner office, the atmosphere was different. Eleanor Grayson sat perfectly still at her desk, her posture upright yet heavy, as though gravity had doubled around her. A cup of coffee rested on the table, steam long vanished. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the whisper of rain against glass. She wasn't working. Not tonight. She was remembering. Decades of her life had been given to this firm. She had joined when Halcrow and Myers was little more than a mid-tier practice in a crumbling downtown building. Back then, it was ambition that drove her. Ambition and a belief that hard work never went unnoticed. She had been fresh from law school, the top of her class, eager to prove herself. She had outperformed her peers, turning around complex research overnight, drafting clauses senior associates praised in private, only to erase her name when presenting them to clients. Still, she told herself recognition would come in time. It didn't. Recognition came to others, the smooth talkers, the men who knew how to order wine in French and flatter board members with meaningless anecdotes. They climbed, rung after rung, until they were partners, while Eleanor remained the invisible scaffolding beneath them. They called her reliable, thorough, indispensable, compliments that were cages. She carried the weight of their successes, but received none of the rewards. And now, after 3 decades, the email had arrived. It had come with the precision of a knife. Your services will no longer be required following the transition. No ceremony, no acknowledgement of loyalty, no thank you for the countless nights she spent hunched over contracts while her personal life withered. Not even a phone call, just a digital dismissal written in the same polite corporate language she herself had mastered. Eleanor had read the email 3 times. Her hand trembled on the mouse before she closed the laptop. She didn't cry. She didn't storm into anyone's office. She simply sat, letting silence fill the room, until the only thing she could hear was the hum of the air conditioning and the faint pulse of her own heartbeat. The irony was sharp. At that very moment, the firm was preparing for what the partners called the crown jewel of their legacy, the merger that would make Halcrow and Myers the most powerful law firm on 2 continents. Billion-dollar corporations were at the table, European investors were waiting to sign, and champagne was already being chilled for the announcement. It would be the biggest deal in the firm's history, and they had chosen this exact moment to erase her. But what they didn't realize, what none of those partners in tailored suits sipping scotch upstairs could imagine, was that the empire they were building still had foundations laid by Eleanor Grayson, and those foundations carried cracks only she remembered. Because Eleanor never forgot a contract, her filing cabinets, her meticulously kept notes, her memory, all of it was a vault of hidden knowledge. She recalled not just the major cases but the minor ones, the forgotten deals, the desperate late-night negotiations where partners had been too tired or careless to notice what she added to the paperwork. One contract in particular had been replaying in her mind all evening. She could see it as clearly as if it were in front of her. The narrow margins, the smudged ink, the final clause she had written almost as an afterthought. When she was still a junior associate nobody cared about. It was over 20 years old now. Back then, Halcrow and Myers had been scrambling to keep a corporate client from leaving. Eleanor had been tasked with drafting the overnight agreement. No partner available, no oversight, just her, a typewriter, and the sound of rain outside, not unlike tonight. She remembered how tired she had been, how the coffee had gone bitter in her cup, how the fluorescent light buzzed above her. She remembered the exact wording of the clause. A retention condition tied to intellectual property rights. The partners had never noticed it. The client hadn't cared. But legally, the clause still held. And in the context of the upcoming merger, that small, forgotten line carried the force of dynamite. Eleanor rose from her chair slowly, the stiffness of age pulling at her joints, and walked to the filing cabinet tucked in the corner of her office. She slid the drawer open. Her fingers moved past folders labeled in her precise handwriting, cases long closed, clients long gone. But she never discarded anything. She believed memory was power, and paper was its safeguard. Her hand stopped on a thin, weathered folder. She pulled it out carefully, as though it might disintegrate if handled too roughly. She placed it on her desk, smoothed the cover, and opened it. There it was. The forgotten contract. Her eyes scanned the text, and when they reached the retention clause, her lips curved in the faintest smile. All these years it had waited, unnoticed, like a loaded gun left in a drawer, and now, with the merger on the horizon, it could change everything. She leaned back, staring at the rain-streaked window. The city glowed below her, oblivious. Somewhere above, in the penthouse conference room, the partners were likely toasting their success, congratulating themselves on their brilliance. Not one of them knew that a woman they had dismissed, overlooked, and discarded held a piece of paper that could unravel their entire empire. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something stir inside her, a pulse of energy, a glimmer of control. They thought they had written her out of the story. But the story wasn't finished. Not yet. Because Eleanor Grayson had never been just a ghost. She was the keeper of forgotten things. And tonight, she had remembered the one contract that could bring the fortress to its knees. The folder felt heavier than it should have, as though the decades it carried had soaked into the paper. Eleanor let her fingers rest on the page, tracing the faded ink as though reacquainting herself with an old friend. The contract wasn't thick, barely a dozen pages, but in those lines of type, buried in subsection 4.7b, was language sharp enough to cut steel. She whispered the words aloud. Retention of rights. In perpetuity. Contingent upon merger or acquisition. It had seemed like legal filler at the time, a precautionary phrase tucked into the margins while partners slept. But here it was, staring back at her like a sleeping giant. With the impending merger, Halcrow and Myers had unknowingly triggered its condition, which meant the client, the one everyone had forgotten, the one everyone assumed was long gone, retained leverage that could block, delay, or even collapse the deal. And the only person who remembered that was Eleanor Grayson. She closed the folder gently and leaned back, her mind already moving faster than her pulse. She couldn't simply walk into the partners' lounge and wave the paper around. They would laugh, dismiss her, twist the meaning until it sounded like nothing. They had been doing that to her for 30 years. No, this time she would need precision, strategy. She would need to remind them that forgotten things can become weapons. But first, she needed to know where the client was now. Pulling her laptop closer, she opened the firm's database. Her access would remain active until her final day, and tonight that loophole was hers to exploit. The client's name appeared at the top of the contract, Midland Innovations, Inc. She typed it into the search bar, her eyes scanning the results. The company still existed. Not only that, it had reinvented itself. Once a struggling regional supplier, Midland was now a key player in renewable technology, with patents worth billions. The irony nearly made Eleanor laugh. The partners upstairs were clinking glasses over an energy sector merger, oblivious to the fact that one of their oldest clients now sat at the center of the same industry. And according to the contract, Midland Innovations still held rights that could strangle Halcrow and Myers' merger before it breathed. She leaned back, staring at the rain-streaked glass. The timing was exquisite. The partners would announce the merger in less than a week, presenting it to the press as flawless. If she timed it right, if she placed this contract in the right hands, the entire deal could implode. The thought filled her with a calm she hadn't felt in years. Not rage, not vindication. Something colder, sharper, control. Still, there were risks. If the partners discovered she had surfaced the contract, they would bury her name, bury her reputation, maybe even threaten legal action. They were ruthless when their power was questioned. She had watched them crush younger associates with careers barely begun. She had seen whistleblowers vanish into settlement agreements, but Eleanor wasn't a junior anymore. She had nothing left to lose. She closed the laptop and picked up the folder again. This was her insurance policy, her weapon, her last chance to remind the fortress that it was never as invincible as it believed. The following morning, the firm buzzed louder than usual. The partners were preparing for another closed-door session, the kind where bodyguards stood by the elevators and interns weren't allowed within 50 feet of the conference room. Eleanor walked through the hall with the same calm expression she had worn for years, the folder tucked neatly into her leather bag. Nobody looked twice. Nobody ever did. She paused outside the glass walls of the boardroom, watching shadows move across the frosted glass. She could hear fragments of conversation, words like valuation, regulatory approval, and European capital. The arrogance in their voices was unmistakable. Her phone buzzed, a number she hadn't seen in years. For a moment she hesitated before answering. "Ms. Grayson?" The voice was male, professional, but carried a note of cautious respect. "This is Daniel Kerr from Midland Innovations. You reached out last night?" "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "I needed to confirm whether your company is aware of a contract signed in 2003, a retention clause tied to mergers." There was silence on the line, followed by a sharp intake of breath. We've seen references to it, but we assumed it expired years ago." "It didn't," Eleanor said. "It's enforceable, and it applies to the merger Halcrow and Myers is about to announce." Another pause. Longer this time. "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor looked through the glass again, watching the blurred outlines of the partners. "Because they've forgotten me, Mr. Kerr. And when people forget the wrong person, they pay for it." She ended the call before he could reply. By evening, word was already spreading in whispers. A legal snag, a clause nobody had expected. Partners stormed through hallways, their voices sharp with panic. Associates rushed to their offices, printing documents, scanning archives. The fortress was quivering, though nobody yet knew the source of the tremor. Eleanor sat in her office, lights dimmed, and listened to the chaos ripple upward. She sipped her coffee, fresh, hot this time, and let the sound wash over her. For 30 years, she had been the silent one, the ghost in the machine. Tonight, her silence was the loudest voice in the building. She opened the folder one last time and slipped the contract into a slim envelope. Tomorrow she would decide where it went, whether into the hands of Midland Innovations, the press, or a regulatory board. Each path carried a different kind of destruction. Each path guaranteed the partners would remember her name. For now, she simply placed the envelope back in her bag, stood, and turned off the office light. The fortress wasn't falling yet, but its foundations had been shaken, and Eleanor Grayson had just begun. The morning after was unlike any Eleanor had ever witnessed at Halcrow and Myers. The fortress was supposed to embody order. Crisp suits, polished shoes, schedules carved down to the minute. But as she stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, the air was electric with panic. Interns darted between offices carrying armfuls of documents. Associates whispered in tight clusters. And even the secretaries, usually calm as stone, wore expressions of unease. The whispers all carried the same word. Clause. Nobody said her name, but Eleanor could feel the ripple. She walked slowly, deliberately, her leather bag heavy at her side. Inside it, the envelope pressed against the lining like a heartbeat. As she passed the boardroom, the frosted glass did little to hide the storm inside. Raised voices, hands gesturing wildly, a partner slamming his fist against the polished oak table. For decades, Eleanor had been the one behind the scenes, typing their words, correcting their mistakes. Now she stood outside, listening as they scrambled over a clause she alone remembered. For the first time, she allowed herself to pause, to savor the reversal. Her phone buzzed again. Daniel Kerr from Midland Innovations. She didn't answer, not yet. Timing was everything. By noon, the managing partner, Richard Halcrow himself, summoned an emergency assembly in the central auditorium. The entire floor was crowded. Associates, paralegals, junior partners, even custodial staff lingering near the back. Eleanor found a quiet seat near the aisle, her presence unnoticed as always. Halcrow stood at the podium, his silver hair catching the harsh fluorescent lights. His voice was calm, but his jaw was tight. "There have been rumors," he began, "of an outdated contract threatening to interfere with our merger process. Let me be clear, this firm does not bow to ghosts of the past. Our legal team is already reviewing the matter, and we are confident it will not affect our plans." The words sounded rehearsed, but the partners seated behind him looked less certain. Eleanor could see the flicker of unease in their eyes, the stiffness in their posture. They knew the fortress had been rattled. She didn't move. Didn't blink. Let them squirm. When the assembly ended, Eleanor slipped out before anyone could notice her. She returned to her office, closed the door, and finally answered Kerr's call. "Ms. Grayson," he said, his voice tight, "I've reviewed the clause you mentioned. Our legal counsel agrees it's binding. If the merger proceeds without our consent, it would violate our rights." "And what do you want to do about it?" Eleanor asked softly. There was a pause. "That depends. Are you offering us this information, or are you partnering with us?" Eleanor looked down at the envelope in her bag. Partnering. The word tasted new. For years she had been nobody's partner, just the scaffolding for others to climb. Now, a billion-dollar company was asking her terms. "I'll be in touch," she said, and ended the call. That evening, the boardroom lights burned long past midnight. The partners were desperate now, voices echoing down the marble corridors. Eleanor lingered by her office window, watching as cars lined up outside. Black sedans, drivers waiting, executives summoned at odd hours. She could almost hear their arguments. Who remembered this clause? Who is responsible? How did it surface now? But they would never guess the truth. Because they had erased her so thoroughly, her presence no longer even entered their calculations. That was their blind spot, their fatal arrogance. Eleanor sat at her desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. She began writing, not legal notes this time, but a plan. 3 options, each with consequences. Deliver the contract directly to Midland Innovations. Let them wield it to demand concessions or collapse the deal entirely. Leak the clause to a journalist. The scandal alone could cripple the merger, destroying Halcrow and Meyer's reputation. Present the contract herself at the next partner meeting, face to face, forcing them to acknowledge her for the first time in decades. Her pen hovered. The first option gave her allies, powerful ones. The second gave her anonymity, a chance to strike and vanish. The third gave her something she had never had before. Recognition. The thought sent a chill through her. Did she want revenge, or did she want to be seen? Her reflection in the darkened window stared back. Older now, lined with years of sacrifice. She realized it wasn't enough to watch them crumble from the shadows. She wanted them to look at her and know exactly who had brought the fortress down. She circled option 3. The next morning, Eleanor arrived earlier than usual. The partners were already gathered, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The conference table was littered with empty coffee cups and half-crumpled notes. Richard Halcrow was at the head, his expression grim. "We've spoken to regulators. We've spoken to European Council. We are narrowing options. But we need clarity. This clause, if valid, could derail us. We need to know who brought it back to light." The room fell silent. Dozens of eyes shifted, searching for someone to blame. And then, for the first time in 30 years, Eleanor Grayson spoke in that room without being asked. "I did." The words sliced through the silence like a blade. Heads turned, eyes wide, mouths slightly open. For a moment, nobody spoke. Nobody even moved. Halcrow's gaze fixed on her, confusion flashing into disbelief. "You?" Eleanor stepped forward, calm and steady, the envelope in her hand. She placed it on the table, sliding it across the polished wood. "This is the original contract. I drafted it. I retained a copy. And now, as you can see, it remains enforceable." A murmur rippled through the room. Some partners leaned forward to scan the text. Others simply stared at her as though she had materialized from thin air. "You kept this?" one partner demanded, his voice sharp. "For what purpose?" Eleanor met his glare without flinching. For moments like this, silence again. But this silence was different, charged, heavy. For the first time in her career, every eye in that room was on her. Not with dismissal, not with indifference, with fear. Halcrow leaned back, his jaw tight. You understand what you're doing, Eleanor? You're threatening decades of work. Billions in revenue. She let the weight of his words settle before replying. No, I'm reminding you that foundations matter. You built this fortress on contracts, and I am the one who remembers them. The room froze. Even the air seemed to stop moving. For the first time, Eleanor Grayson was not invisible, and she knew this was only the beginning. The silence in the boardroom stretched until it felt like a living thing, pressing down on every chest. Eleanor stood at the far end of the polished table, the envelope resting before the partners like a live grenade. For years, these were the men who had looked past her, spoken over her, claimed her work as their own. Tonight, their eyes held something she had never seen before. Not dismissal, not indifference. Fear. Richard Halcrow broke the silence first. His voice, usually smooth as glass, cracked at the edges. Do you realize what you've done, Eleanor? This contract, this oversight, you could unravel everything. Eleanor's gaze was steady. Not oversight, intention. You taught me to guard the fortress. I did. I remembered what you all chose to forget. Another partner leaned forward, his face pale. What do you want? Money? A settlement? For a moment, Eleanor considered the offer. A payout, a quiet exit. That was the fortress's favorite tactic. But no. She hadn't waited 3 decades for a check. I want recognition, she said. Her voice was calm, measured, but it cut through the room. My name on the work I created. My legacy acknowledged. No more silence. The words hit harder than any demand for millions. The partners shifted uncomfortably, some whispering, some looking away, because money they could handle, but admitting they had erased her, that was poison to their pride. Halcrow leaned forward, his hands gripping the table. And if we refuse? Eleanor slid the envelope closer to him. Then Midland Innovations receives this contract by tomorrow morning. The press the day after. Regulators the day after that. Your merger collapses before the ink is dry. The threat hung in the air like smoke. One by one, the partners realized she wasn't bluffing. She had already spoken to Midland. She had already made herself known. The fortress was no longer in their hands. Finally, Halcrow exhaled, the weight of surrender etched across his face. What exactly are you asking, Eleanor? She straightened, her presence filling the room in a way it never had before. I want my position restored, no elevated. Not as a shadow in the back office. As senior partner, effective immediately. My contributions acknowledged, in writing, in every future press release. And I want oversight on this merger, on my terms. Otherwise, she tapped the envelope once softly. This contract becomes public. The boardroom was still. Then slowly, Halcrow nodded. Agreed. The days that followed rewrote the fortress. The merger proceeded, but under new conditions. Eleanor's name appeared in press announcements, her title elevated, her presence undeniable. Associates whispered her story in hallways, how the invisible woman had shaken the empire with a single sheet of paper. For the first time in 30 years, Eleanor walked through the office not as a ghost, but as a force. Heads turned. Conversations paused. People knew her now. Not just as the quiet workhorse, but as the woman who had forced the fortress to kneel. And Midland Innovations? They reached out again, this time not with suspicion but with respect. If you ever want a seat on our board, Daniel Kerr told her, it's yours. Eleanor smiled politely but declined. She wasn't done here yet, because Halcrow and Myers had spent decades erasing her. And now, she would spend the rest of her career carving her name into its very walls. On her final night of reflection, Eleanor stood once more at the window of her 22nd floor office. The rain had stopped, the skyline glowing clear and sharp. For the first time in years, the view didn't mock her. It mirrored her, strong, unshaken. She whispered to the glass, as though the city itself needed to hear it. They forgot me. But I never forgot myself. Her reflection looked back, calm, powerful, unstoppable. And for the first time, Eleanor Grayson allowed herself to smile. Power doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who remembers what everyone else forgets. Never let anyone erase your worth, because one day, the world will remember you.